QSO Today, Episode 510, Mike Patron N1CC. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. My thanks to the listener sponsors who make regular monthly support of the QSO Today podcast. It pays for the services necessary to produce and offer the podcast to all of you. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio? Do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. My voice is an octave lower from the summer cold caught from the high school teacher XYL with whom I live. I am now back a week from the USA after beginning the probate process on my dad's estate. I could write a book on it and how much we want to leave our children when we leave this mortal coil. In the end, I took more mementos of my family's history, like letters, diaries, and buttons for the granddaughters from ancient sewing kits. The rest, my brothers and I left to the Goodwill and anyone else who could benefit from the over 100 years of accumulation. Even photo albums and scrapbooks, we tore out pages to be scanned and shared, another project in the future. In the end, my lesson is to offload as much stuff as possible while I still can to spare my kids and grandchildren the physical work to break it all down in the future. Mike Patron N1CC had an early love for amateur radio that was eclipsed by aviation, leading Mike to become the longest-serving captain pilot at FedEx. Returning to ham radio during the COVID-19 pandemic, Mike rediscovered his love for CW through the Long Island CW Club and remote controlling his FlexRadio home station while traveling the world. N1CC is my guest in this QSO Today. N1CC, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Mike?
Hey, Eric, N1CC, you're 5 and 9. I'm operating remote today from Indianapolis, Indiana.
Which is a great town. I used to have cable systems that were around Indianapolis, and so I was in Indianapolis many times. So, Mike, it's so nice to have you on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you? And you could start with your hometown as well.
Okay, well, I was born in 1959 in Cuba, and we came to the United States when I was 2 years old, and I grew up in New York on Long Island. And this is back in the day before personal computers and smartphones, so there was no email and no text messages, no WhatsApp. And if you wanted to talk to your friends, you either picked up the phone or you went over and visited, which is what we normally did. But I had a group of friends that discovered CB radio. They all had base stations, and I went and visited with them, and it seemed like they were having a lot of fun talking with each other. So I did the same thing. I even installed a mobile rig on my bicycle, because I had a paper route. So as I was out delivering papers, I was talking to all of my friends. And I distinctly remember certain Sunday mornings when propagation was just right. I could hear faraway stations. And I was never able to work them. But the desire to work faraway places and visit those places and their cultures really has been important in shaping my life and my career. And I knew that if I wanted to work those stations, I would need to become a ham. I didn't have any guidance. There were no Elmers, but somehow I learned that the local club was holding lessons on the weekends to get an amateur license, novice back then. So I started going every weekend.
Did you know any hams before?
No. I had one friend who lived down in the harbor, and his neighbor had a ham radio shack. he took me upstairs in this man's house, and it was all Collins S-line. To me, it looked like the cockpit of the spaceship Enterprise. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. So I aspired someday maybe to have something like that.
So you had an exposure, even if it was a short exposure, you kind of knew that it existed.
I did. And so I went to these lessons every weekend, and at the age of 14, I licensed as a novice, WN2WHP. This was 1974. It's hard to believe that was 50 years ago. I didn't have a lot of money. I only had a paper route. I bought a receiver. I could hear some stations, but I never made a ham radio contact. And shortly thereafter, I moved down to Florida, and I started my aviation training there. And that became the focus, education and starting an aviation career. And really, it wasn't until I turned 28 that I was able to turn my focus back on amateur radio.
So let me ask a question then. You were going to this amateur radio club. You took a course. You passed the course. You took the novice test. What happened that there was nobody there to offer you some help, get you on the air? I mean, it seemed to me that that was a hopping time for ham radio, especially in the New York area.
I don't know, Eric. I was always a shy kid. I didn't really reach out or make any friends that would have been Elmers. I wish I had. It would have been very important. But anyway, I made those friendships.
Did you remain on the CB, though, at the same time?
No. Well, I moved. I moved from New York down to Miami, Florida, and started flight training. And that just became the singular focus. And it wasn't until I was 28 years old. I was an airline captain. I was living on Sanibel Island in Florida. I was flying nothing but European routes. And I once again was able to turn my attention back to amateur radio. There were no lessons being taught down there, but Gordon West had this amazing training system of tapes that I was able to take with me on the road. And by the way, I just met Gordon West at Dayton 2 weeks ago, and I thanked him profusely for getting me from novice through general, advanced, and extra in less than a year. So I licensed as a novice again in 1992, KD4KQH, and progressed to amateur extra that year, AC4TJ. And this time I was able to buy a rig. I bought a Yaesu FT1000D and had a vertical antenna, and I was living right on the water, and the propagation was amazing, and I was able to work the world. So it took until age 28 to finally live the dream that I wanted about amateur radio.
I want to talk a little bit about your aviation education, because as a kid from Cuba who grows up in Long Island, who has a paper route, how did you get interested in aviation, and how did that lead to a career as a pilot?
I've had a fascination with aviation my entire life. I knew it's what I wanted to do since I was 2 feet tall, as Jimmy Buffett would say. I got my start at aviation, believe it or not, selling Christmas cards in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. I think my neighbors all took pity on me, and they bought Christmas cards from me, and I was able to get a little Cox 049 U-Control model. From there, that's all I ever wanted to do was fly airplanes. And when I moved down to Florida, my father, who really I had met for the first time at that point, he and my mother had been separated. He wanted me to be a doctor like his father and his grandfather. Of course, I would have been a terrible doctor. I didn't want anything to do with that. I wanted to be a pilot. And he thought, I'll send the kid to flight school. He'll get sick of it in a couple of months, and then we'll send him off to med school. And it backfired on him. So that's how I got my aviation training start down in Florida. He sent me to Burnside Ott Aviation Training Center, which at the time was the biggest and the best civilian aviation training center in the world. And I had wonderful training.
So as a kid who had an interest in aviation, were you doing airplane models, gliders, balsa wood. What were you doing as a teenager in terms of, it sounded to me like you were a hobbyist. What were you doing?
Absolutely. My two lifelong hobbies have been amateur radio and radio control airplanes and helicopters. I do them both to this day. As I said, I started with a little U control and then got my first radio control model. My dear friend's father I met down in Miami, and he taught me how to fly. And I have flown radio control my entire life. At one point, I was competing nationally in precision aerobatics. I just have always loved model aviation.
Fixed wing, rotary wing, gliders, what is it you like to do, or do you like to do all of it?
I like all of it. My passion was precision aerobatics, and a lot of the precision aerobatic pilots took up helicopters because flying radio-controlled helicopters is the hardest thing you could possibly do. It teaches you to use the left stick on a transmitter, which is your power management and your rudder. So a lot of the precision aerobatic fixed-wing pilots would learn helicopters. So I did that as well. And to this day, I'm still doing both.
If anybody looks at your QRZ page, there's some pictures. Your model airplanes aren't the ones you find in the hobby store. They look like they're 10th scale or something like that.
40% scale. That was always the dream, to get model airplanes that would fly, replicating full-scale aerobatic airplanes. And really the technology had to evolve, mostly in power plants. But finally, there was a competition held every 2 years called the Tournament of Champions, and it had a lot of prize money. And it drove innovation in that arena. And finally, the big airplanes with strong enough power plants came to be that they're just a beautiful thing to watch. It's graceful. It's like a ballet in the sky. It's a beautiful thing to watch.
Unfortunately, I can tell you that I have wasted many hours on YouTube watching model airplanes look like they're on full-size runways. They're going at jet speeds. And you are exactly right. They are something to behold. In order to build a plane that's 40% size and a power plant, are you saying that there are hobby jet engines that could go into these airplanes in order to give them the speed and the dexterity in the air?
There are. I started with what was called ducted fans, which were not really jet engines. They were gas engines that would turn a fan. And I was kind of one of the early adopters to that and had a lot of fun with it. But really, I wanted to do the big sky aerobatics, and those jets were more about, high speed, low passes, which are cool. But after the 100th low pass, I was ready to do something else. And so by the time the real jet engines came out, I had already focused elsewhere. But the technology has continued to evolve with these very sophisticated jet engines. They even have what's called FADEC, full authority digital electronic control, which we have on the big jumbo jet, the real airplanes. They have miniature versions of that control the starting and the shutdown and different parameters. The club that I'm a member of in Scottsdale, Arizona, where I live now, there are a lot of guys there with jets, and they're cool to watch.
You're on the ground, and you're kind of controlling these airplanes. Are you high enough that you actually have to file flight plans, or does the FAA know that this is a closed area for a Saturday morning when this is happening? How does that work?
That's a really interesting question, and it's not a really good story. Model aviation and modelers have a rich culture of safety above all. And unfortunately, what ended up happening is with the advent of drones, it started attracting a different crowd into model aviation. All of a sudden, people didn't have to spend the time to build something or get under the tutelage of a mentor to help them learn. They could just get out there and start flying right away. And it was sort of an instant gratification crowd that started doing crazier and crazier things to get their thrills. Like, let's fly one into the White House lawn, or let's hover at 1,500 feet, 5,000 or 5 miles from the airport, and let's film the Southwest jet as it goes right by. And they were doing all these irresponsible things, and the FAA, as big government often does, overreacted, and it's really had a negative effect on model aviation. We're under a lot of restrictions. Believe it or not, I can be held liable for actions with my model airplanes that would have an effect on my pilot license to fly commercially. So it hasn't been a good story. The drones have had a very negative impact, but we're working through these regulations, and I hope there's light at the end of the tunnel.
It's my understanding that one of the reasons you came back into the hobby at that time was you actually wanted to apply amateur radio technology to the control of your airplanes. How does that work? And are there organizations, clubs, vendors that specialize in remote control systems for airplanes that are on amateur radio frequencies? Because I don't think I've ever seen it in the QST.
Right. Well, back in the day when the transmitters were FM for flying radio control, there were ham bands. And back then, the receivers were very susceptible to interference. You had to be very careful. Every flying field had a board with frequency pins. And if you transmitted on while someone else was flying, you could crash that airplane. I've had it happen to me. And with ham radio, you were able to fly on frequencies that nobody else had. So for years, I operated on the ham bands. You knew it because your flag was a black flag that you flew. You never had a conflict. So, yeah, those were great days. But as technology evolved into what's called spread spectrum today, those frequencies went away because now the transmitters are sending out many, many different frequencies that only the receiver is paired to, so you don't interfere anymore, and no one flies on the ham bands.
Are you using like the 900 megahertz or the ISM bands? Are these the non-licensed frequencies, like 900, 433 megahertz, things like that?
Right. It doesn't require any license to operate modern radio-controlled transmitters.
And they have a decent range.
They do. Line of sight is what we do in model aviation. I understand that the drones can go beyond line of sight, and that's one of the things that you have to get licensed for to do now. But that's nothing that I participate in.
And now this mid-show break. The QSO Today project that now includes 500 episodes of the QSO Today podcast, the curation of hundreds of hours of QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo presentations for public consumption, is now supported completely by you, the listeners. I am using a business model called Value for Value, a concept developed by Adam Curry, K5ACC, where you contribute to QSO Today exactly what you think its value is to you. Value for Value. This mid-show break and the promotion of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast later in the show are the only commercials that interrupt the program. QSO Today has no commercial sponsors to influence the content, direction, and editorial content of the QSO Today project, which exists solely for the promotion of the amateur radio hobby. Those of you that have listened to over 500 podcast episodes know that I'm not only infatuated by the amateur radio hobby, but by the people who perpetuate it as well. The hours that I dedicate to QSO Today is a half-time job.
Your support at any level pays for all of the technology that I use to create, produce, host, and deliver the QSO Today podcast and the project to the ham radio community. And while it is a labor of love, it costs money. I know from statistics and surveys that only 6% of you actually contribute to QSO Today in some form. Please make a generous donation using the slider to set the amount of your donation. Make that donation monthly to ensure that QSO Today is here for the next 500 episodes. As a value-for-value donation, it should be in the amount that you value each episode of QSO Today, or your access to our amazing catalog of ham radio educational videos found on YouTube, Vimeo, and using our own player, link in the show notes page. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually. Use my Amazon link in the right column of the QSO Today website before shopping on Amazon. Promote QSO Today to your friends and family by forwarding our email and social media posts. Subscribe to our mailing lists. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Tell your friends. All of these actions are value for value. Keep the QSO Today project alive by taking action now. We return to our QSO Today. So now you find yourself in aviation. What does it take? How many hours in the air does it take from the beginning where you get into the Cessna 150 and to the point that you're now a captain of a Federal Express jet? How many hours of work was that in the air?
I think on average it takes about 10 years to gain enough experience to get on at a major U.S. airline. I was very fortunate. I started flying when I was 15. I got a great head start, and I had a lot of doors opened for me. And as a result, I was able to get on at FedEx at the age of 23. And so today, I'm approaching age 65. And I'm 41 years with the company, and it's been a great career. I've watched the world change, and it's been incredible to be part of it. In the early days of FedEx, we were changing the way business worked in the United States, bringing overnight services to corporate America, and then in the late 80s and early 90s, the world was changing. The Berlin Wall came down, and Microsoft developed their first Windows operating system. The internet was born, the internet browser, when Netscape went public and the dot-com boom began. All of a sudden, high-speed broadband was available around the world, and these multinational supply chains began. As Tom Friedman says, the world became flat, and FedEx was at the epicenter of all of that. And I was able to participate in it, flying all around the world, which kind of takes me to now 2018, 2019, when COVID hit, because all these countries shut down and commercial aviation passenger carriers shut down. But companies like FedEx, UPS, DHL, we kept the world running. And I was on the tip of the spear. I was all throughout China, Asia, all around the world, all throughout COVID. It was very difficult days. We were not treated very well. We were locked in our hotel rooms for days and days, sometimes with armed guards right in front of our door. It was remarkable. But one of the big changes that I saw during that time, and I decided to get back into amateur radio after 28 years away from it. And that's where my current call sign, N1CC, came from. But software-defined radios had evolved, and in particular, FlexRadio was kind of out there on the point in operating remote. And that had a great deal of appeal to me because I thought, wow, if I could, fly around the world and be able to play radio back home, that would be terrific. And so I bought a Flex. I set up my station. I took off on my first international trip to Asia. I was on a layover in Anchorage. And so I opened up my laptop. I fired up my station back home. I could hear the stations all throughout the band, but I couldn't get my microphone on my MacBook to connect. I still don't know why. So I decided to try CW, even though I hadn't sent a lick of CW in 28 years. I heard a station sending a CQ at a pretty slow pace. He was sending something else besides CQ, but I couldn't copy. I didn't know what it was. So I threw my call sign out there, and he answered. And it ended up being Jim, W6JIM. The man had the patience of a saint. He was so kind in getting me through my first QSO. And so I felt great. I finished my trip throughout Asia. I get home, and there's a QSL card waiting for me. And it's from Jim, W6 Jim. And on there, he said, hey, come see us at the Long Island CW Club. I had no idea what the Long Island CW Club was. But having grown up in Long Island, I thought, well, let me look these guys up. So I looked them up. I made application, and I was warmly greeted by club founder Howard, WB2UZE. He's been on your show. I listened to his interview. And it turned out Howard grew up in the town right next to mine on Long Island. At that, we would have gone to the same exact high school, except that I moved to Florida. So I had an instant connection. I was warmly greeted. And Long Island CW Club, I started learning Morse code now for the third time in these Zoom lessons. And you wouldn't think it's possible, but you start building friendships and bonds with people that you actually never met in real life. And it couldn't have come at a better time because, like I mentioned, we were locked up in these hotel rooms. And here I kept my sanity by visiting with my friends every day on Zoom and learning CW again.
Were you using the keyboard to send the CW at the time when you were using your MacBook? Or did you actually have some kind of a key to use the space bar as your straight key?
That is such a great question, Eric. My first contact, I didn't even own a key when I made that. So, yes, I was using the keyboard. And once I got back into it, I wanted to operate with my own key. And what's fascinating, it could be a show unto itself, is how easy it is to work remote now as long as you're willing to use a keyboard. But if you want to use your own key remote, it adds a complete level of complexity to it. And I was able to do that.
So Bigali needs to come up with a USB adapter for their...
No, Bigali's already done it. The Bigali CW machine is one of the ways that you can do it. It takes two of them. And that's what I was doing. I had one CW machine at home, one that I would travel with. And then what happens is, aside from the way you operate your rig remote, the CW machines connect over the internet in a client-server relationship. And so what you're sending when you're in your hotel room in Hong Kong goes over the internet, is received by the other CW machine at your home station, and that's what keys your rig. But you have to deal with a host of challenges, from latency to port forwarding at home and firewall rules, and sometimes setting up a DMZ. And it's just, it's complicated.
So you're giving me all kinds of ideas. But it seems to me that the CW machines or something like that, some IP-based long wire to your Bigali key, would have less latency than actually running through your interface to the FlexRadio. Although I would imagine that you're probably pretty close to getting to a point where you could probably take a Maestro with you on the road.
Well, see, if you have, that's the whole thing. You need to interject some form of hardware solution if you're going to use your own keyer. If you're willing to travel with a Maestro, that's it. That's a perfect hardware solution. But that thing is too big to carry on the road if you're traveling all around the world. Elecraft has done the same thing with the K40 that they're about to release, and they also have, I don't know what they call their little controller. Eric was just showing it to me at Dayton, and that's going to be able to be the hardware interface to be able to do it. So there are more and more solutions to get there.
For remote control. Yeah, this is very interesting to me.
K-Pod, Eric, that's what he called it.
Before we get to the Long Island CW Club, because I want to talk a little bit about your involvement there, one of the things I like to do on QRZ is I like to look at the map of where you live, and I like to zoom in, and I look at the picture, and I'm looking at an HOA, I'm assuming. But I thought it was very clever that you've got something in the backyard that kind of resembles maybe a 108-inch CB whip on top of a post with a tuner at the bottom. Am I kind of right in terms of you figured out how to put the stealthy antenna into the neighborhood and to be able to operate your rig? Could you talk a little bit about how you are handling the HOA challenges in your neighborhood?
Yeah, the key is to stay under the radar and pray that you have some understanding neighbors with a sense of humor. And I lucked out in that regard. So I've put out an end-fed half wave, and I've got another little antenna as well that kind of hides behind a cactus. So it's not the greatest antenna, but that's okay because now there are commercial services like remote ham radio where you can have access to multi-million-dollar stations if you're willing to pay, $1 a minute. When I need the horsepower, I can go to a super station. Other than that, I've got a very modest station at home.
You're all over the place. I'm assuming that from Indianapolis, where you are right now, that you've whipped out the Apple laptop and used your station. How does it work? I mean, is it good enough that you can make contacts and have regular schedules and things like that?
Oh, the actual remote operations of a radio now are very, very straightforward. It's very, very easy to do as long as you've got, a decent Wi-Fi where you are on the road. The challenge is in using your own key. That's where the additional layer of complexity comes in. But if all you're wanting to do is, use a keyboard for CW, it's really straightforward, very, very, very simple. And there are solutions. Every manufacturer has their own solution now to do it.
Because they're going to get left behind if they don't have some remote control capability.
Yeah.
One last thing. It was my understanding that FlexRadio owners had some kind of an organization or perhaps agreements, gentlemen's agreements in terms of maybe using their stations when they're not on the air. Does that really work, and have you tried that?
I'm not familiar with any organization that does that, but, with both Flex and Elecraft, if you have the login to your friend's station, you can operate it just like you're operating your own. And I have done that for friends, give them access to my radio so that they could use it. And that's, remote operating, there's a broad range of people that would be interested in doing it. And some of those people are folks that live in cities with high noise floors, and they want access to quieter stations. There are people that live in retirement homes. They can't have a radio, but this gives them access to that. There's a revolution going on in contesting where now instead of having to get, a dozen people to show up in one place, they can just log in remotely and operate. It's really interesting.
It is interesting. Okay, now, so let's get back to the Long Island CW Club. It's my understanding that you met Jim. You had the first QSO, probably, I think you said this is probably your first CW QSO in your ham radio career?
No. When I lived on Sanibel Island in 1992.
You were doing some CW?
Yeah, I did plenty of CW. Back then, you needed 20 words a minute to get your extra, so I was practicing to get there. But I moved to Alaska and to Hawaii, and I wasn't involved in amateur radio for a 28-year period. When I got back in it in 2018, 2019, and my first contact, and certainly my first remote contact, ended up being CW.
So you became first a student at the Long Island CW Club as a way to kind of bone up on your skills?
I'm still a student at Long Island CW Club. And yes, they helped me relearn old skills and learn new ones in Morse code. And that kept me engaged and active during the COVID lockdown. And as my skills progressed, Howard was always talking to me about teaching a class someday. And of course, I wanted to give back to the club. I still do, but I wasn't able to commit to teaching a class because of my crazy schedule. But I wanted to find my own way to give back to the club. And the club communicates mainly through its reflector on Groups.io. And if you sit there and just watch the traffic, you start to see trends. You see new students asking the same questions over and over, and it gives you an idea of things that could be improved. And one of the first things I noticed was that there was ambiguity about the path through the academics. Where am I? What should I do next? It was always a common question. So I decided to try and tackle that, and I created an academic flow, which required taking every class and assigning it a class category, and then creating a flow chart so that students could visualize, this is where I am, this is where I want to be, and this is how I can get there. So that was kind of my first special project. Well, actually, my first special project, I did a presentation on remote operations for the club. And then my second project was the flow chart, but there were more. That's really what drove my involvement in curriculum development. There was a constant drama about class resets.
What is a class reset?
So at the time, the beginner's curriculum was linear in nature, which meant that it started at a defined point or reset with only a couple of characters, and then every subsequent lesson built on that body of characters. And that was effective from an educational perspective, but from a scheduling, practical perspective, it meant that if you didn't start at the beginning or near the beginning, it was easy to feel overwhelmed. And none of the classes were synchronized. So every beginner's class was at a different point. Each class was resetting at a different time. And the students sometimes would have to wait a month or two for a class to reset. And so it was constant drama around that. And I thought that was ripe for improvement. There was also concern that a lot of the beginner students were not progressing as desired into the intermediate curriculum. A lot of them were stuck at about 6 words per minute. At the time we were teaching, as most academic organizations were, with a high character speed and a high degree Farnsworth spacing. 20 over 5 is what we were doing. And our students, a lot of them were just stuck there at about 20 over 6. Somebody coined the term the Farnsworth trap. I don't believe in it, but bottom line is a lot of people were stuck at that, and that was of concern. And then the other thing, we were using the G4FON trainer as our primary training tool at the time. And that trainer, as well as other trainers, have a character sequence that is referred to as the Koch character sequence. And that's what we were using. And that started with the letters KMRSU. I just couldn't understand why anyone would develop a character sequence with letters that you can hardly make words out of. So we had concerns and curiosities that drove us to start doing research. And what was interesting is we found dozens and dozens of fascinating historical documents dating back to the late 1800s about how to learn and how to teach Morse code. Because Morse code was critical to the military and the war efforts back then, there was a lot of research to try and improve teaching methods and to try and reduce the amount of time required to make a CW operator and to screen out people that didn't have the aptitude so that militaries wouldn't waste their time training people that were never going to reach proficiency. So there was a lot of information out there, and I immersed myself in as many of those documents as possible. Some of them were written in German. Of all the documents we read, the two that were of most significance to us were the 1936 report by Ludwig Koch from Leipzig, Germany, and the 1943 doctoral thesis at Harvard by Donald Taylor. And the Koch report is written in an old technical German. And one of our club members helped us get it professionally transcribed. And so we did a deep dive into that document. I bet you I've read the Koch report 30 times. If I could summarize the Koch report, it's that CW characters should be learned as single acoustic sounds and not by reference to a visual chart, which Koch referred to as the analytic method. And in reading that Koch report, I looked hard for the character sequence KMRSU to find this so-called Koch character sequence, but it was nowhere to be found in the Koch report. So we kept looking and reading more and more documents, and we finally found it. The character sequence was developed by Otto Lippmann in 1919 in Berlin, Germany. And the importance of Lippmann's work is that he was the first to theorize that one could accurately predict future performance in learning Morse code by how well a student learns their first few characters. And to 71 of his students, he gave what he called an obscure character sequence of varying difficulty. And what do you suppose that was? KMRSU. And it turns out Lippmann was absolutely correct. Taylor validated it in 1943. And to this day, the most accurate predictor of future performance in learning Morse code is how well you learn your first few characters. But we just realized, oh my gosh, we have been teaching with an aptitude test. And so we thought, we can do better than this. It turned out Koch gave significant guidance in how a sequence of characters should be built, which characters should be avoided being put together, and where the distribution of the difficult characters should be. But we also took a cue from Samuel Morse and Alfred Vail. And remember, when they were developing Morse code, they wanted to find out how often letters were used in the English language. And this was before the day of Google and the internet. So they had to do research in the old-fashioned way. They went to 2 local newspapers and they counted the typeface in the cabinets to determine the frequency of use of the letters. And to the most often used letters, they applied the easiest Morse code characters. So we took a similar approach, except we wanted to find out how often characters were used in the QSO protocol, which of course is how we communicate in Morse code. And so to the most often used letters in the protocol, we place them earlier in our character sequence. And what that allows us to do is to very tightly integrate QSO protocol and QSO abbreviations into this new beginner's curriculum that we were developing. The idea being that students, as they were learning their characters, they could also learn how to communicate in Morse code.
And how did this PhD scholarship on Morse code, on teaching the Morse code, it seems to me that you could probably take this to a university and get your PhD on it after all of this research. How did you apply this to the curriculum at Long Island CW Club so that it got rid of some of the objections that students might have been having as a result of being out of sync, or how did that work out?
Well, Eric, when you look at our modern curriculum at the Long Island CW Club, it is a blend of historical best practices with our collective experience of teaching thousands of people Morse code. And let me give you another example of bringing forward historical information. Remember, we were concerned that our students were not progressing, and that we were concerned by using this high character speed with enhanced spacing. It turned out that Koch experimented extensively with character speed. A full third of his report was dedicated to it. And Koch found that characters needed to be sent at a minimum of 10 words a minute to be heard as single acoustic sounds, what he referred to as gestalt. And Koch zeroed in on 12 words a minute as optimum for initial learning of CW. Now, that wasn't his ultimate goal. Koch wanted to get his students to 20 words a minute, but the Koch method is to achieve proficiency at 12 words a minute and then ramp toward 20. And our club mantra is to prepare students to get on the air. And that seemed awfully consistent with our mantra because, as you well know, most initial contacts out there are in that 12, 13 word per minute range. So we decided to adopt Koch's 12 words per minute for initial learning of CW.
So you've kind of backed off then on Farnsworth and Farnsworth spacing?
That's right. There's a place for it, but very little. We started 12 over 8, transitioned to 12 over 10, and by the time our students finish in the beginner's curriculum, they're at 12 over 12, which is a twofold increase in proficiency from the curriculum that it replaced, and an easy, seamless transition into intermediate now.
I see. And so, if I understand this correctly, then, if I'm already in that 12 over 12, that the way to start to increase my proficiency, applying this method and maybe using some Farnsworth spacing, meaning I'll send my characters now at 15 words a minute with 12 word spacing, and as my spacing starts to improve, then I keep inching up the character speed. Does that sound what you're doing?
It is. We're really skipping ahead now into intermediate, and I can talk about that in great detail. Maybe a little bit later it would make more sense. But in general, let me just say that character speed only changes the sound of the character. Effective speed is the true measure of proficiency. So, we have students all the time. They come to us. They say, oh, I'm learning at 30 over 10. Well, there's no difference between 10-10, 20 over 10, 30 over 10, or 100 over 10.
It's still 10.
It's still 10. All you've done is change the sound of the character. And our approach is that character sound familiarity is the foundation of recognition or copy. In other words, you should become familiar with the sound of the character at the target that you're trying to get to. So if you're trying to get to 12, send it 12. If you're trying to get to 16, send it 16. And while you're doing that, the idea is to focus on effective speed, which you can express as Farnsworth words per minute or as a time. And the concept is to reduce the interval between when characters are heard and when they are recognized. The goal being the quick, the effortless, and the accurate copy of code. We call that instant character recognition.
And now this mid-show break. Every 2 weeks, I listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Vince, VE6LK, Mark, N6MTS, Thomas, K4SWL, Michael, VA3MW, and Rod, VA3ON, and their guest on often topical and important projects in amateur radio. This discussion amongst the regulars and their guests remind me of the conversations that I used to listen to on 146.94 and 146.46 megahertz in Orange County, California, while working on my own workbench almost 50 years ago. It is amazing how much practical ham radio knowledge that we can absorb by listening to the Workbench podcast that starts to make sense when we start our own deep dive into our own projects. So join me by listening to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast now and as George and crew push beyond 200 episodes. You can get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast by clicking on the banner in this week's show notes page. And now, back to our QSO.
When you learn how to read, you have like whole word recognition. Wouldn't that be what you also want in Morse code, is you want to actually hear the whole word itself, or at least enough of the word to be able to recognize the word so that you're actually not listening to individual characters?
The concept of instant word recognition is fascinating, and it's something that we employ. The cool thing about instant word recognition is it happens by itself. If you were to hear a CQ or a 73 or the word the, or BEST or TEST, those things just pop into your mind, and you never tried to learn those words, but by repetition, they come. And we call that an alternate means of copy. And when we get into our really high-speed curriculums where character by character copy is less and less feasible, then we really explore alternate means of copy, such as instant word recognition and phonic copy.
And what have you seen now that you're implementing this new curriculum, and obviously the teaching methods derive from the curriculum? What successes are you seeing now with your students?
Well, we're seeing a threefold increase in the number of students in our intermediate curriculum. So we're seeing a great throughput from beginners to intermediate. And the truth is that every student has different goals. You know, but you may want to be a rag chewer at 12 words a minute, and that might be your bucket list goal. Somebody else might want to be a high-speed contester or proficiency at head copy. There's a broad range of goals and objectives out there. Our job is to help each student achieve their goals to the best of their potential.
I hate to say this, but have you compared what you're doing with, say, CW Academy? I actually went through the CW Academy course, and I thought it was amazing. Have you done any comparisons in terms of the approaches and how that works?
I'm a member of CW Ops. CW Academy is amazing. They do great work, and we respect it very much. Our clubs cooperate all the time. They have different teaching methods. There's no right or wrong. They do a fantastic job, as do we. It's just different methods, different goals and objectives. It's all good.
Well, I guess what I find interesting is how now that CW is not required for the license, that it seems to be probably more popular as a mode now than it ever has been, and that the methods for teaching CW has become so much more sophisticated than I remember it once was. When I was learning CW as a kid, you used a paper and a pencil and you were writing down every character. And it seems to be this approach is not to, in fact, that may even be a handicap by writing down characters as the characters are coming through, rather than head copying.
Well, the copying down isn't necessarily a problem. What was a problem at the time was that the FCC had required 5 words a minute as the speed of your CW test in order to become a novice. And when you're learning at 5 words a minute, you can't hear the character as a single sound. So we were all memorizing a chart, and in our mind, we were referencing that chart when we were copying code. And then as a result, to this day, the hardest thing I've ever done in Morse code was to get past that 10 word per minute wall where you can no longer reference this chart in your mind and you have to start hearing characters as a single sound. So to get my general at 13 words a minute was the most difficult thing I have ever done in Morse code. So that's the issue. It's not writing it down. You can learn by writing it down and then progress into head copy with no problem. As a matter of fact, our entire intermediate and advanced curriculum is a comprehensive and structured approach to achieving conversational head copy proficiency.
How many students do you think have gone through the Long Island CW Club?
Thousands. Yeah, we're sitting at somewhere around 5,200 members. We're in all 50 states and I think 54 countries around the world. It's just incredible.
And what do you think of teaching aids like Morserino or some of the Windows-based, I've used Linux, but I used a thing to convert it. But what do you think of some of the software programs and devices for practicing CW if you're not doing it on the air?
Yeah, so there's initial learning, there's practice, and then there's experiential learning, on the air. We believe the optimum way for initial learning is a classroom environment with a live instructor. And I can give you plenty of examples for that. If the best way to do that would be to just describe our teaching methods for how we teach characters. But when it comes to practice, our club developed its own Morse practice page, a web-based, cross-platform, highly sophisticated training program with our curriculum and teaching methods tightly integrated. And, Morserino is great. There are great programs. We partner tightly with Kurt Zogelman, the Morse Code Ninja, and his content is just amazing and highly effective. So there are a lot of great ways to practice. And, of course, nothing's better than getting on the air. But for initial learning, a classroom with a live instructor is really optimum.
Maybe there's no ending to the number of potential students that you could have. But what's next for the Long Island CW Club? Do you see it expanding the kinds of courses it's offering, or the maybe social activities or contests, or what kind of activities are happening?
Of course, my focus is on the academics, and we hold 138 classes a week, and we're going to be at 150 by the end of this year. And that's, a tremendous effort. We focus heavily on our instructor training and evaluation programs. We spend as much time teaching our instructors as we do teaching our students to ensure a consistent student experience and to give each student the best opportunity for success. We're very selective in who we bring on as an instructor. We only select instructors that have a really high degree of empathy for their students, and that creates a very unique and strong bond between the student and the instructors, and it actually imbues the entire club with a desire to volunteer and give back. And we call that our secret sauce. And that's what keeps the club going, is that the club volunteers. And then, of course, the customers keep coming in. They're joining at an incredible pace. And so we are always struggling to serve them better. And with more and more international members, we now are standing up classes at times specific to them. We just started classes at 6 a.m. East Coast time, which is perfect dinner time, Oceania. And we have Australian instructors teaching that. We are in the process of training Spanish-speaking instructors, and we will be standing up classes for Spanish-speaking students. So we are looking at our international members and trying to serve them better. After we finished building our beginners curriculum, we just a few months ago built a whole new intermediate curriculum based on achieving head copy proficiency. And now we're working on refining our advanced curriculums, which take you all the way up into the realm of high-speed telegraphy above 45 words a minute. So there's always room in academics to do more and to do it better. We have a culture of continual improvement. We're a fail fast, move forward group. If we see something that isn't right, there's no pride in authorship. We are quick to refine it, and we're always looking at better ways of doing things.
What's your student demographic? Do you think that CW and the way that you're teaching CW could attract new hams to the hobby?
That's a great question. The demographics are really all over the board. You can't ignore the real energy that Soda and Poda has brought to CW. You got the young generation that wants to be out in nature. They want to be able to bring a rig that's small, that doesn't require big space, big antennas. And so the CW is perfect for that type of activity, and that's driving a lot of membership. And then you have the other side of the equation. You got people that wanted to learn Morse code. It was a bucket list item, and they just never got to it. And so we have a lot of members that join wanting to finally, I've been wanting to do this, my whole life, and now I'm going to do it. And we give them the confidence that our academics can get them there. And then Howard has created a club with a very special culture that does wonderful things that people want to be part of and want to support. And those things combined are driving the membership and the increase in academics.
What excites you the most about what's happening in ham radio now? Is it this resurgence of CW?
I get fulfillment from watching the light bulbs go off in students. I get a great deal of joy in teaching and into helping those that are teaching to bring fulfillment to their students. So that's why my focus is on the academics. There's always ways of improving, and we're always trying to do that. On the operational side, I just left Dayton. Flex announced their new 8000 series, and I was one of the first people to sign up at 9 a.m. for the new 8600. So I look forward to getting that in August and continuing the remote operations. I retire in August, and we bought a little RV, and I bought a portable rig that I plan to take on the road, and so I'm looking forward to doing that as well.
Plus, you'll have your satellite internet connection on the RV so that you can then get back to the mothership if you need.
I actually do. I just set it up last month with Starlink. It's unbelievable. I've got high-speed broadband in my little Class B RV.
I think that's amazing. What advice would you give to newer returning hams to the hobby then, Mike?
Just relax and don't take it all too seriously. Don't put undue pressure on yourself. Don't bring those things that made you successful in the private life of drive, and don't bring that in here. Everyone learns at different rates, and the keys to learning Morse code are to learn how to learn Morse code, to understand the teaching methods and to follow them, and to learn how to practice productively, and to have fun while you're doing it. And as long as you can keep fun into the whole thing, you'll remain motivated, and then you'll go at your own pace and just enjoy the journey, and it will be very, very rewarding.
Mike, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. I realize, as many of my guests do, that there's just nothing to talk about, but then we talk over an hour on what interests and excites you, and I'm so happy that you joined me, and I think that this will be an excellent opportunity for people to learn more about what you're doing and what the Long Island CW Club is doing as well. I had no idea, frankly, that it had grown as large as it has grown and that its teaching methods were so advanced. So with that, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast and wish you 73.
Thank you, Eric, for having me. Thank you for everything you do for chronicling amateur radio. and thank you for making me feel so welcome. It was an absolute pleasure. So 73, my friend.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Mike. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put an N1CC in the search box at the top of the page. You can sponsor the transcription of this episode or any of the previous episodes by clicking on the transcription button on every show notes page. The cost is $75 per episode, regardless of the length. We will quickly transcribe the episode and give you credit for your sponsorship. Please send us the call sign of the podcast to make sure that we transcribe what you want. Remember that QSO Today is value for value. Please support our project by making a donation or becoming a listener sponsor today. Use our Amazon link before shopping at Amazon, as we receive a small commission on your Amazon purchases. Subscribe to our mailing lists, both my blog and the podcast, and forward the messages to friends and family who would enjoy QSO Today content. Promote us on social media and give us a 5-star rating and reviews whenever you are asked. QSO Today is available on every podcast player and venue, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and Podcasting 2.0. Get a Podcasting 2.0 player to make it easy to get your next episode as soon as we publish. My thanks to Ben Bresky, who, as the consummate artist, makes this host and his guests always sound brilliant. Ben also publishes a weekly Jewish history podcast. There is a link to that on the QSO Today homepage. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.